I had heard the rumors about St. Mary's Hospital for years. It was an old building, standing since the early 1900s, with a dark history of mismanagement and mysterious patient disappearances. It had been abandoned for decades, yet it loomed over our small town like a ghost from the past. The stories people told about it were terrifying, but none of them involved ghosts or spirits. They were about something far more sinister. One evening, I found myself drawn to the hospital. I was a journalist by profession, and my curiosity often got the better of me. This time, it was my ambition that led me there. I wanted a story that would put my name on the map, and uncovering the secrets of St. Mary's seemed like the perfect opportunity. With a flashlight in hand and my camera around my neck, I entered the decrepit building through a side door that had been forced open long ago. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of decay. My footsteps echoed through the empty hallways as I made my way deeper into the hospital. The light from my flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the peeling walls. Each room I passed seemed to hold a piece of the hospital's dark history, with broken furniture and medical equipment scattered about. As I moved further inside, I found an old operating room. The rusted surgical tools were still laid out as if waiting for the next patient. It was then that I noticed the large, metal door at the back of the room, slightly ajar. My heart raced with a mix of fear and excitement as I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was pitch black, save for the beam of my flashlight. As I scanned the area, I saw rows of filing cabinets lining the walls. They were filled with patient records dating back to the hospital's early days. I pulled out a few files, curious to see if they contained any clues about the hospital's dark past. What I found was beyond disturbing. The records detailed bizarre and unethical medical experiments conducted on the patients. The doctors at St. Mary's had been involved in some sort of clandestine research, testing the limits of human endurance and mental stability. Many of the patients were listed as missing or deceased under suspicious circumstances. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I continued reading. It seemed that the hospital was a front for some government experiment, and the patients were unwilling participants. The deeper I delved into the files, the more I realized that these experiments were still ongoing when the hospital was abruptly shut down. But there was no explanation for why it had closed so suddenly, leaving everything behind as if everyone had simply vanished overnight. Just as I was about to put the files back, I heard a noise. It was faint, like the sound of distant footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned off my flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps grew louder, and they were coming my way. I scrambled to find a hiding spot, eventually squeezing myself into a narrow space between two cabinets. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and I could hear the faint sound of breathing. Someone was standing there, just inches away from me. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, before the footsteps started again, this time moving away from the room. I waited until I could no longer hear them before daring to come out of my hiding place. My hands were shaking as I turned the flashlight back on. I knew I had to get out of there, but my curiosity got the better of me once more. I decided to follow the footsteps, hoping to find out who, or what, was still in the hospital. I moved silently through the hallways, following the faint sound. It led me to the basement, where the air was even colder and the smell of decay stronger. In the dim light of my flashlight, I saw a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and a faint light was coming from inside. I crept closer, peering through the crack. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room was filled with medical equipment that looked disturbingly modern compared to the rest of the hospital. In the center of the room was an operating table, and on it lay a person. They were strapped down, unconscious, with an array of tubes and wires connected to them. A man in a lab coat was standing next to the table, writing something on a clipboard. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was as if the experiments had never stopped. I pulled out my camera and took a few photos, my hands still trembling. But as I did, the flash went off, illuminating the room. The man in the lab coat looked up, his eyes locking onto mine. Panic surged through me as I turned and ran. I could hear him shouting behind me, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the hallway. I sprinted up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I burst through the side door and out into the night. Gasping for breath, I looked back at the hospital. It stood there, silent and imposing, as if mocking me. I knew I had to tell someone, but who would believe me? The evidence I had might not be enough to prove what I had seen. In the days that followed, I tried to contact authorities and share my story, but every attempt was met with skepticism or outright dismissal. It was as if there was a cover-up, and I was up against something much larger than I had anticipated. Months later, as I was about to give up, I received an anonymous tip. It led me to an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. Inside, I found a cache of documents and videos that confirmed everything I had discovered. The experiments at St. Mary's were part of a larger government project, and they were still ongoing, now hidden in plain sight. But just as I was about to leave, I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head, and everything went black. When I regained consciousness, I found myself strapped to an operating table, much like the one I had seen in the hospital. My vision was blurry, but I could make out the sterile, white room and the harsh fluorescent lights above me. The cold bite of the metal restraints sent waves of panic through my body. The man in the lab coat stood over me, a sinister smile on his face. "Welcome to the next phase of our research," he said, his voice dripping with malice. I struggled against the restraints, but they held firm. The fear that had been simmering inside me now erupted into full-blown terror. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to croak out, my throat dry and parched. His smile widened, and he leaned in closer. "You see, we've been looking for someone like you, someone with a curious mind and a will to uncover the truth. You're perfect for our latest experiment." He turned away, and I heard the clinking of metal as he prepared something out of my sight. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing like a death knell. The room was filled with the hum of machinery and the soft beeping of monitors, creating a symphony of dread. "Do you know what the most fascinating aspect of human fear is?" he asked, his back still turned to me. "It's the way it can be manipulated, studied, and harnessed." I felt a sharp prick in my arm, and my vision started to swim. Whatever he had injected me with was taking effect. My mind raced, desperately trying to find a way out of this nightmare. As the drug coursed through my veins, my senses became heightened. Every sound, every shadow seemed amplified. The man in the lab coat began to speak again, but his words were distorted, echoing in my mind like a sinister chant. Suddenly, I was no longer in the sterile room. I was back in the hospital, but it was different. The walls seemed to breathe. The shadows writhed like living things. The faces of the patients from the files I had read appeared before me, their eyes filled with torment and accusation. They reached out to me, their hands cold and clammy, their whispers a cacophony of despair. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The terror was all-consuming, a suffocating blanket that threatened to crush my sanity. And then I saw him, the man in the lab coat, standing at the end of the hallway, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He raised a hand, and the shadows closed in around me. Just as I thought I would be swallowed by the darkness, I was jolted back to reality. The room was spinning, the faces of the patients still lingering in my mind. The man in the lab coat was laughing now, a cold, mirthless sound that sent chills down my spine. "You're experiencing the first phase of our fear amplification experiment," he said, his voice a haunting whisper. "Your mind will be pushed to its limits and beyond. Every fear you've ever had, every nightmare you've ever experienced, will be brought to the surface and magnified." He leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. "And the best part? No one will ever know what happened to you. You'll simply disappear, like so many others before you." As he stepped back, I realized the true horror of my situation. I was trapped in a living nightmare, with no hope of escape. The experiments at St. Mary's were far from over, and now I was just another victim, lost to the darkness. The last thing I saw before my vision faded was the man in the lab coat, his eyes gleaming with sadistic pleasure. The darkness closed in once more, and I knew that this time, there would be no waking up.